Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome to Red Hoop Talk, a Native news and talk show brought to you by the Association on American Indian Affairs, the oldest nonprofit serving Indian country. I am your wonderful Vanna White. I am your host for the evening, Shannon O'Loughlin. I'm a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and also serve as the chief executive at the Association on American Indian Affairs. We've got a great show for you tonight. Tonight, as I look out my windows and the sun's still out, well, except for the rain, we're having a few thunder showers here in the lands of the Piscataway people, otherwise known by those that are colonized as the state of Maryland. We're happy to be here with you tonight. So I hope wherever you are out there, you give us a shout, give us some comments, let us know who you are, where you're watching from, and please feel free to ask us any questions. Hopefully they'll be relevant to our speaker and the topics that we're talking about. But hey, if they're not, we'll do our best to address those as well. We're coming to you through Facebook, through Twitter and Periscope, and through our YouTube channel. So we're going to hear comments from folks from all of those places out there in the internets, in the wild internets. Hey, JD, it's nice to see you from your lands and your places out in the Southwest. And everyone else as well. So this week, I hope everyone did something, wore some red on May 5th on Wednesday, which was the president, Mr. Joe Biden, actually proclaimed as the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons. And so there were runs, there were fundraisers, there were live shows, and a lot of things going on in Facebook and in our communities all over the place. And also what was going on is Instagram was taking away all of our social media that had to do with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and others. And the reason for that was it seems that the word murder or murdered, and hopefully we don't get our things taken down tonight, is one of those keywords that the bots out there in Instagram and Facebook land, when they hear, they pull the social media down. So a lot of folks in Indian country have been considering how they best address the issue in social media. And so people are talking about protecting Native bodies. And so you may see kind of a shift in language so that we don't get all of our social media events and postings pulled down. The associations was pulled down for a time being too, but I think all over the United States and Canada, everyone's postings were getting taken down. Hey there, Lance, nice to see you. And then we have someone, looks like from Ireland. Is that what you meant to say? Yakoki from Ireland. So there's an actual Choctaw person listening to us from Ireland. Welcome, nice to have you. And we're probably related. Nice to see everyone out there. Please, if you have forgotten for some stupid reason, which means you're probably not a good person to begin with, this Sunday is Mother's Day. So we all have an obligation to make sure that we recognize and take care of our mothers and our people that serve as mothers to us, to our communities, to the earth. And you don't have to be a woman to be a mother. There are many things that make a mother, some necessity and some just by our roles and responsibilities in this life. But I'm grateful that I have the makings of of being a mother in my belly, or at least they used to work back down there. And I have a 14-year-old son that I'm grateful to be a mother for, and really going to enjoy Mother's Day as best I can. I think I'm forcing my family out in the woods on a hike and a picnic maybe, and I'll watch them suffer and sweat a little bit, and that will make my Mother's Day a little more merry. But thank you to all the mothers out there, and we'll be thinking about you on Sunday. So please let us know who you are out there, where you're coming from, if you're affiliated with a tribal nation, and if you have any questions for us tonight. So our special guest for this evening is a man I'm very grateful for in my life. He is the president of the Association on American Indian Affairs, and he is recognized as a strong tribal leader. He serves as the executive director of the United Tribes of Michigan. He's also a potter. He served his tribe, the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa in Michigan, as tribal counsel. He continues to serve as an appellate court justice, and he's with us tonight, Mr. Frank Ettawageshik. I hope I didn't mess any of that up. Frank, how you doing?
Doing good tonight. Going good.
Good. So where are you talking to us from?
Well, I'm speaking from the Odawa homeland here in near what's known today as Harbor Springs, Michigan. We're in Waganukasing, the land at the Crooked Tree place.
At the Crooked Tree. And is the Crooked Tree close? Whoops, you got cut out a little bit. Sorry about that.
Well, this area, we're at the northern part of the tip of the lower peninsula of Michigan on the Lake Michigan side, between Little Traverse Bay and the Mackinac Straits. That's our traditional homeland, although we certainly traveled much further and lived in a broader area. But this is where my family's been from for generations. And before that, we were just a little further east for many more generations. And but this is where the tribe Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians. We're right on Little Traverse Bay. Our close relatives are other tribes throughout Michigan: Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa Indians, Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and there are other tribes throughout Michigan that we're all intermarried and related, as throughout this whole region. I'm pleased to be able to really be in the land here on Mother Earth, where my ancestors are buried, and where the stories and everything that are part of my tribal history are all around me.
Yes, and that's not just a history. You have got an incredible resume, Frank, and it's almost difficult to know where to start. But one thing that really intrigues me about who you are is your work on your tribe's council during a very formative time of your tribal nation, fighting the U.S. government. And do you mind talking a little bit about what that legal case is about and why?
Well, what happened is we signed treaties, clear back the Treaty of Greenville, 1795, and treaties since then, culminating with the Treaty of Washington of 1836 and also the Treaty of 1855. And those were the last two treaties that we signed. And we were one of many Ottawa, Odawa, Ojibwe bands that signed these treaties. And instead of in some areas of the country where the tribe as a whole was recognized as a whole with many different locations, in Michigan, the tribes, for the most part, are being identified as governments in each of the different separate locations. For instance, Grand Traverse Band, that lives an hour and a half south of us about, and Little Traverse, we're intermarried, we're closely related, and yet we have separate tribal governments, separate constitutions, separate ways of governing. They're similar, but separate. And so what happened with my tribe is that, and with most of us in this region, is after the Treaty of 1855, it contained a provision in it that said the nation of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians is hereby dissolved. And a lot of readers stopped at that point.
Right.
But the next phrase is, and the powers are resumed by the bands. In other words, there was an artificially constructed nation of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians that the federal government put together. All of us that live within this very large area of Michigan, it's over half the state of Michigan, and it's part of a good deal of the lower peninsula, and the eastern third of the upper peninsula is contained in that. And they took all the tribes that were in that area, all the different individual bands, Ottawa and Chippewa, and they created artificially this nation of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. And they signed a treaty with that nation, the Treaty of 1836. And when we signed the treaty, of course, it was difficult pulling people together from all those different places all over the state. And when we signed that treaty, it had permanent reservations. We had reserved land for ourselves permanently. Got to understand, a reservation, the root of the word is reserve. So the federal government didn't give it to us. When we ceded the rest of the land, we reserved land for ourselves. And the land that we had reserved in 1836 was in a reservation that, when we signed the treaty, were permanent reservations. And those, but then it was sent off to the Senate for confirmation. And while it was there, it was changed. And when it came back here, it now read that they were 5-year reservations, and they could be extended at the pleasure of the president. And we basically sign or else kind of thing at this point. So we did, but we had some problems with that treaty because it was with this artificially constructed nation that really hadn't actually all met together very often in the past. And so we were looking to do a new treaty, and the new treaty, which was the treaty that we negotiated for 1855, in that treaty, we, at our own request, we asked that this artificially constructed nation be dissolved, and the powers they go back to the bands, to the individual bands. And this is the way we wanted it, because then we could each petition for any issues that we wanted resolved ourselves. So, and so that was put in there at our request, and that we signed that treaty. And then, decades later, a couple decades later, somebody read that the nation was dissolved and said, "All right, you guys don't exist anymore," instead of reading the second part of the sentence, which said the powers had all reverted to the bands. And so there was a big amount of discrepancy as to whether we existed or not. And so we were in that sort of limbo. And this is through all this time period about in this time period, we go through the Indian Reorganization Act. There's a whole thing about, they're trying to get rid of the tribes. Teddy Roosevelt called us the vanishing Americans. He figured that we were going to just disappear completely, all over the country. But in our case, we were still here. We were here in our homeland. We did not move. A few did, but most did not move to Kansas or to other areas of the country. We stayed right here in our homelands. And we continued to do the things that our treaty said we could do. And that caused a great deal of problems, because one of the things it said we could do is hunt and fish. And when we did, we'd get arrested and we'd go to court. And one of the gentlemen I know who was a leader at the Little River Band, his grandfather had a copy of the treaty book and had a copy of the treaties. And he'd go into court, he'd open the book up and he'd show the judge, says right here, we can do it. And they'd throw the case out and then that'd be it. But they had to keep doing this. And that was only if they had a judge that would actually read the treaty. If they had a judge that didn't think that that didn't like that, what happened is often that didn't happen. So we had a lot of trouble. This was true for all the different bands in this whole Treaty of 1836 area, Treaty of 1855 area. Well, what it meant is that we ended up fighting a 120-year legal battle over whether we existed or not. And for some of the tribes that are within this large area, they had one of the tribes in that area had reorganized under the Indian Reorganization Act in the 1930s. So there was one tribe, small, that had been reorganized, and then other one got organized within this same treaty area, got recognized through. They were the first tribe through the federal recognition process that came out. And meanwhile, we were filing suit over fishing rights and other things, and we were struggling about existence. So while I was the chairman at the time that we resolved this, I was just one in a long list of leaders who had gone to Washington, had fought, had tried to do things. Ogimagachigokwe, one of the women leaders of our area of the tribe, had gone to Washington to try to get the president to restore land that had been stolen from Indian veterans of the Civil War. While they were off fighting the war, their land was stolen. And so she went to try to do this. She took quill boxes and other things with her that when she went there to DC, she was selling them to try to get the money to keep her trip going. And she got to Washington. She got in the same room with the president, but she was unable to get the president to resolve the issue. And so she came home, and everybody at home was all really excited about her coming home, thinking she was going to be had resolved the problems. And meanwhile, she'd sold everything that she had. So she was coming home penniless. And she wrote a letter about how she felt when she was looking at all the expectant faces of everybody waiting for her. And she knew with a heavy heart that she had to tell them that she had been unsuccessful. And she wrote that letter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Well, she felt that she hadn't accomplished anything. But that was one of the pieces of evidence that I used in my testimony when we were testifying before the U.S. Congress back in 92 and 93 in the process to try to get a bill that reaffirmed our tribal status. And that bill for Little Traverse and Little River, Public Law 103-324, and its companion bill 103-325 that reaffirmed the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. Those two bills went together at the same time and were signed on September 21st, 1994 by President Clinton. But in that process leading up to that, I was able to bring some of those stories, like this woman who had gone to D.C. and came home, felt that she had lost felt really dejected and bad about it. And there are other people. Some people lost their farm because they mortgaged it to pay to send people to Washington to try to solve some of our problems. They were unable to do it. They couldn't pay the mortgage and they lost the farm. And there were these people who felt that they had lost over the years. And we were able to vindicate their battle and actually win when we got the president to sign this bill that reaffirmed our federal status. Because we always said that we always were federally recognized. We were not, this bill didn't grant us recognition and it didn't restore recognition, but it reaffirmed that we'd always had it. And this is what our people had always said, and it's what we fought for. So I was the chairman at the time that bill passed.
Wow.
But the credit, I was standing on the shoulders of so many other people who had fought for years to do this, that it was the tribe. It was the tribe's success in getting this done.
Wow.
And so, of course, then a whole different battle started.
And what would that be?
want to go out and get this battle done. As soon as I'm done with this, I can go back to being a potter and doing art fairs and doing the things that I was doing before. And I can go back to doing that. But then, well, we got in, but then we weren't in the federal budget. And because those of us had been doing this battle, we were the ones most experienced in Washington in the halls of Congress. We were the ones who had to go and fight the budget battles with the bureaucracy to get in the federal budget and to get these other things done. We had to, negotiate about the size of our user population with IHS, and we had all these different things we had to do. And of course, we didn't know about these things. We had to learn them as we went. And but we were able to do that. And just one metric of this: when I started, I was first elected the chair. We had $4,000 in the bank, no land. We didn't have an office really, and we had our records were stored in boxes in people's attics and trunks and under the bed and things like this. And we had a government, but we didn't have a visible physical presence. And what we did is we had to turn that into a physical, to the physical presence with an office and staff. And we started with that $4,000 in the bank. And over a period of time, it got to where time I left, after 14 years of being the chair, the tribe had grown through the efforts of all the council members and all the tribal members that had worked. We had managed as a group to get our budget up to a $30 million annual budget. We had a gaming operation and we had a health clinic. We had all of these different things. And I was able to witness all of that happening. And I say that I witnessed it because, it's not something that I did, but I sort of was around while it was happening, and I helped encourage it and did what I could to help those people who could make those things happen for us.
Wow. So today, when you look at your nation and what is there, and what you grew up with compared to what the youth in your nation have today, what is it like? What's the difference?
Well, part of it is I'm 72, and a lot has changed for everybody in those 72 years. But I can give you an example. We had Vine Deloria, who, while we were in the process of working on this reaffirmation bill in the U.S. Congress, while we were in the process of doing that, we had a grant from the Administration for Native Americans, and the grant was a status clarification grant. And one aspect of that was to work on a tribal constitution. We had a draft constitution, but we needed to talk about the constitution. We needed to have something that would be approved in the reaffirmation bill. And we needed to start this process. And so we were looking at the process, and I had recently read The Nations Within, Vine Deloria, and it's all about the Wheeler-Howard Act and how that whole thing came about. And I thought, man, we really need somebody that can talk about this. And there were several of us speaking, and we don't remember who, but somebody said, well, why don't we just ask Vine? So we did. And Vine came and got really involved with us and liked what we were doing. And he volunteered to be our lead testimony at our first hearing for the U.S. House on the bill.
Wow.
And so he came and worked with us to do that. But in the process of doing this, I got to know him. And over several years, he talked to us, and he told me that, 15 years before we did ask him to come here, or maybe 20 years, he'd come to visit, and he came through this area. And although there were Indians living in houses in different places, he also found Indians living in cars out in the woods without houses, and living in houses with dirt floors and no indoor plumbing. And he noticed the extreme poverty generally of the Native people here in our region. And then he came when we got him to come with this grant. We had him speak at the Perry Hotel in Petoskey, Michigan. We now had an office. We had a small staff. We were working on status clarification. And he came and spoke to us at that point. And then just a few years before he walked on, he came to our tribal center, which has a big vaulted ceiling, with big beams, and it's a fire pit in the middle, and it's a big ceremonial place. We have a kitchen, we have our elders' lunches there. We can have ceremonies in there, and weddings, and state dinners, and other things, and have our offices there. So he comes to this really incredibly nice building it's not just a square office building. It's a building that encompasses the thought process of the tribe. The fire pit, for instance, is the center. We have colored tiles in the 4 directions around that. And this is the centerpiece. When you walk in the front door of this administration building, you walk into the ceremonial center of the people. And then the offices are all in wings that are off on facets from that. But if you go from one wing to the other, you got to go through the center every time when you walk back and forth. So it has people. It physically talks about, just by being in it, what the tribal values are and what things. It helps you put a frame on who we are. Well, Vine is sitting there and he's telling us this story about his first visit to our area, then his second visit when he came to the hotel, and now his third visit. And he's comparing all 3 of those. And to me, that his words that day were extremely valuable to think about, because as things are happening, you don't realize how much change is happening on a day-to-day basis. But when you start to look at it over the decades, you really notice a big change. And one of them is that when we started back, I first became the chair in 91. And when I became the chair, I think we had maybe 2 employees, and then we lost our grant. We lost all our employees. Okay. And then we had 1 computer in the office. Everybody had to share it. Okay. to do any work. And we had this, but the growth was just a little bit incrementally from there. And we went up to where, we ended up creating nearly 1,500 jobs in the community that were all full-time jobs at one point. I mean, the economy's changed. We had to cut back some at the casino and back and forth, but we have around 1,000 jobs in the community that are paying benefits now that didn't exist here 30 years ago. And this is something that's happened for our people. We also worked on adopting a constitution in the process of this. We have a separation of authorities constitution it's similar in structure, say, to the U.S. Constitution, where there's checks and balances. So we have the chair and the vice chair here run as a team. And then we have a 9-member tribal council, and then we have a tribal court. And all of these are created in the Constitution. They're constitutional bodies. And they're independent from each other, with the exception of the kind of things like, the executive turns in a budget, the council adopts a budget, the budget is for everybody. But then, but there are checks and balances and how that whole process works. And I always describe constitutions to people that the Constitution is the means which the people use to protect themselves from their own government. Now, some people think that that's sort of a strange way of looking at it, but the Constitution, we grant powers to our government through the Constitution, but the authority for that comes from the people. It doesn't come from the document. And through that document, the people grant power to the government, and they reserve the right to either take away some of that power or give more. And that can happen through amendments. That's how they do it. And so it's a check on the government. And we want the government to operate slow enough that we can see what's going on, and also to be transparent in the way it works, so that we actually know what's happening. Under our old Constitution, the tribal council had all the authority, and the chair, the executive function, was part of the council, and the a tribal court was created because the council passed a law that created it. So if the court ruled against the council on something, the council could abolish the law and start a new court. And and things could happen with this just like that, because you could introduce a bill and pass it right at the same meeting without anybody even know you were doing it. And that's under that old Constitution. Those things could happen. And the only reason they didn't is we had people in there who refused to act in that manner. But had we chosen to do it, we could have done those things, and it would have been really detrimental to the people. And so the new Constitution has these checks and balances between an executive function that has to sign the laws but can veto them, and the council that passes them and appropriates money, and a court that can resolve the disputes and deal with other issues as our tribal laws are created. So we have this checks and balances, and the checks and balances are there to protect the people. And that's why, to me, it's so important to have that. It makes the government more cumbersome, makes it a little slower. It's a process that sometimes appears to be designed to create friction, okay, because it does. Difference of opinion. Our council has had to sue the chair, and the chair's had to sue the council, okay, over interpretations of the Constitution, and the court has had to resolve those issues. But I tell people that, 80 years ago, we would solve those problems with baseball bats in the parking lot. And today we use attorneys, and we're doing them in a much more in a productive way that is lasting and actually creates a more stable government, which also means that we create a more stable possibility for economic enterprises and development.
So how does, and I don't mean to spend so much time on government, but this is such a fascinating issue because, I think we've all worked, who work in Indian country, with such a diversity of tribes and how tribes govern themselves through a constitution or otherwise. How did that change occur from really a non-working government that was built on kind of, who had power and who was going to usurp power from others, to a functioning government where there's those checks and balances? Was it just leadership and people that were able to kind of turn the trajectory towards that kind of working government? Or, what miracle happened to make that possible? Because I know so many tribes suffer with problematic government institutions.
Well, I think I'd look at it a little bit differently. And the way I'd look at it is that we always had the ability to do this. We always had institutions within our tribe to deal with these kind of issues. And the federal government came in and pretty much outlawed our traditional way of dealing with things. And they made it very difficult for us to function with the traditional government. And there was the whole boarding school era where they were out trying to take the Indian out of the Indian and removing us from our culture and our clan system and everything on how we used to govern. And so there were so many problems there. And I think what we've done is sort of reawakened the ability in the community to govern ourselves. We've reawakened that, and we've given new tools to it, but it's not a new process. This idea that you have a government that treats people fairly and that provides for the health and safety of the community and the food for the community and all of these different things. This isn't some new thing that we're doing. We've always done this. We've always had ways to deal with this. And we're using some modern tools. We're using computers, for instance. I once worried about this because I'm saying, how can computers be traditional? How can this be? And one of the elders told me, he said, well, I've thought about that. And you know what makes that computer work? It's that electricity. And what is that? That's those thunders. That's that electricity. He said, that's one of our gifts. We're just using that gift in this way, but there's not anything inherently wrong with using this technology. We have to be careful, like anything, how we use it. But it's us. It's something we can do. And so we talked about opening a casino, and there were some people saying, "Oh, we can't do that because that's going to be all this business, all these terrible things, and it's going to do terrible things to us." And we had an elder once who spoke to us, who he'd asked for a few minutes at the end of one of our community meetings as we were talking about the time when we were getting ready to think about opening the casino. And he'd listened through the meeting, and he asked for a few minutes at the end. So we always opened with that. We had a drum, and we had the Eagle staff and the flags come in, and we had a pipe ceremony at the beginning, and then at the end of the day, the drummers would line up, or they'd get around the drum, and the flag carriers would all get down by their flags, and so we'd asked the elder. He said he had just a few minutes he needed, so maybe 20 to 5. Meeting was going to end at 5. At 20 to 5, we invited him up, and he started speaking. And he talked for quite a while, and the drummers were sort of sitting around in their chairs, and the flag guys, they were moving from foot to foot, standing up there, and as we're doing this, and it's now 5:00, and he's still speaking, and then it's 20 after 5, and he's still speaking, and now people are getting real restless. It's now 5:30, and pretty soon it's like 5:45, and he's still speaking, and he finally wraps up. But what does he say? What he says to us is, Wingasik, he said, you got to watch out. Zhonya by itself is neither good nor bad. The money, it's not good or bad. It's how you use it. It's what you do with it. It's how you take care of it. And so you have to be careful. And he said, what these young people are doing, it's good, but we have to be careful and make sure we do it wisely. And so out of those teachings and things, I learned to say this, that when we talk about exercising sovereignty, I say sovereignty is the right to be as dumb as you want to be. But it's the responsibility to be as wise as you can be. So you have both, like any right and responsibility that there is out there. Every right, there's a responsibility goes along with it. Same thing with sovereignty. If you're going to exercise sovereignty, you can choose to do anything you want, no matter how stupid it is. But you also have a responsibility to do it as wisely as you can, to do things and to do the best you can to take care of people. And so it's that balance that you have. And that's what came out of these discussions. So when you talk about how you apply our traditional values in a modern governance system, we're using computers today. If the power goes out, we send all our employees home because computers don't work and nobody can do anything. At one point that was different than that, but the only people still working are the police and the health workers, but everybody else is gone because there's nothing anybody can do because everything's on the computer, all the forms and everything. And so, but we've changed. I tell this story. My first job in Indian country was working at the Keweenaw Bay Indian Tribal Center in Baraga, Michigan. I had just come from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. It was my first job outside of college, and I was coming from it was back in the 60s, so I was coming out of Ann Arbor in the 60s, and it was a pretty wild place, in terms of people demonstrating and all the other things going on and all this. But I came up there, and when I got there, I was sort of in a bit of a culture shock because I went from there right back out to the reservation where I was teaching pottery to kids. And I came to work one day, and there was a 3x5 card hanging on the door. It wasn't even taped in straight, and it was just hand lettered, and the door was locked. and I'm coming to work, and the door's locked, and I'm going, what is this? And the sign says, salmon are in. The tribe, everything's shut down because the salmon were there. And I'm going, oh, that's interesting. But what happened is that we have to fit our cultural teachings and our cultural ties around the structure that we have. So we can't just hire an MBA to come in and be efficient and tell us how to run everything efficiently, because that efficiency might fly in the face of our values. And so we have to find a way to be efficient while living our cultural values. And if it means that we close the casino when we have a funeral in town, even though they tell us you can't do that, you're going to lose all this money. We go, well, we're going to close because, a third of the employees are Native, and almost all of them are related to the person who just walked on. And so they're not going to be here. And we feel that's we need to close in the honor of this elder that's walked on. And so, there's different kinds of values that you have to figure out how to work with. And to me, that was one of the big ties. We were debating when we were looking at our human resources committee, and we were looking at developing personnel policies. And we were in the middle of talking through the system. And, on our tribe, we have traditional people who are part of Badewan, and we have people that are part of the Wabano. We have people that are other traditional values in the Native American church. We have Catholics and Protestants. We have Muslims. We have atheists. Okay, we have all of this different people of different types of faith that are all members of the tribe. And so within all of that, in a substantial portion are Catholic or Protestant, probably equal to the traditional people. And so there's always a little bit of a tug and pull here. And so we're doing the personnel policies. We're trying to decide what days we're going to have. We're going to put in the policies what days we can have off. And I'm an advocate that we need 4 cultural days that you can have for no excuse. You just get them off if you say you need them. And I wanted that in the personnel policies. They said, oh, we can't do that. And I said, okay, well, let's work on Christmas then. They said, what do you mean you can't do that? I said, well, I'm not a Christian, and Christmas is just a social holiday to me. It's not sacred that I can't work that day. And so they said, well, we can't do that. I said, then I get my 4 cultural days. So we traded 4 cultural days for Christmas. Okay, in terms of our personnel policies. And and we also didn't take President's Day off. We took Michigan Indian Day off. So, I mean, there's certain things, but we wanted to be sure that what we're doing is we did not want to develop a system at the tribe where you had to choose between working and being an Indian.
Right.
What we wanted a system where our cultural values were reflected in the policies and the procedures that we adopt, so that we can not sort of outlaw our traditional values, which is why in our Constitution, very early, we delegate the authority to the tribal council to govern, but we do it through the lens of our cultural history and heritage, so that everything they do from that, and it's very early in the Constitution, so everything after that is to be looked at through that lens. And which means that we also, we made sure that no law could be passed that you couldn't speak Anishinaabe-Moan, our language, and that we would try to make sure that our cultural value system was available to all of our tribal citizens without any penalty whatsoever at all, instead of them having to figure out how to work around. Now, have we been successful? To a great degree, yes, but there's still work to be done. And I look at that and think about that governance is something that's never done. It's something that you always have to be thinking about it. It's always going to evolve and change, but you try to do it on the wisdom of your elders and your ancestors, but you do it for your descendants. And so we always think about those coming. What are we doing that is going to leave a world for them that actually is as best we can do? This day and age with all the stuff going on, it's hard to say whether we can leave a world that's better than what we have, but we can at least leave a world that's as good as what we have.
Yes, yes. And I want to, so I don't want to ignore folks in our chat. It looks like Stephen Perry wants to say hello.
Hello.
And
we see each other in ceremony often.
And so is Kara Smith. She wants to say hello.
Okay.
And I'm also seeing our friends, Rory Wheeler, one of our board members, and also Colleen Medicine is in there listening, our program director. So you've got some friends and family in the chat there, Frank, joining us, which is nice. And so you were talking about your ancestors guiding, the governance, and it's very clear from looking at your creative work, your work as an artist and a potter, that you were absolutely guided by your ancestors. I mean, the work that you've done with your pottery, I can't imagine what that must have been like to kind of recreate processes to create the pottery. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure.
And I'm not sure if I set it up very well.
I mentioned that, that I left Ann Arbor and went to work at the Keweenaw Bay Indian Tribal Center.
Yeah.
And what I had done is an apprenticeship in a commercial studio, learning to do stoneware pottery and raku pottery in Ann Arbor. And I'm a native person. I didn't know an awful lot about native pottery. In fact, I knew very little about the traditional pottery at this time. But I did this apprenticeship working with clay and firing it and selling things in a store and, setting up for art fairs and doing other things like this, and did this apprenticeship. And I got I got an offer to teach pottery to Indian kids up at the Keweenaw Bay Indian Tribal Center in Baraga, Michigan. And I ended up going up there and getting that job. And I felt that I should try to be teaching these kids the pottery that their ancestors had made. And I didn't know much about that. So I went back down to the University of Michigan and went into the University of Michigan Exhibit Museum. And there was a student docent sitting there flipping pages, doing her homework. And I walked in with a friend of mine from Baraga, and Joe Dowd, and the two of us walked in, and we stood there. We said, "We'd like to see the pots." She goes, she looked up and she goes, "Indians." And she passed us like a hot potato back to somebody else, to somebody else, to somebody else. And before we knew it, they opened a big door and opened this great big thing up and left us in the room with all these pots. And they were from the Young site in down near Lapeer, Michigan. And there were pots in there from, this big to bigger than I could put on the screen here, huge storage pots. And we studied those and looked at them and studied the design on them and looked at how they were made. And it occurred to me as I'm looking at these that my technical expertise in making pottery was not good enough yet to be teaching kids how to do this, because I'm going to have to learn how to do it myself. So we left there. We went back up, and I taught raku pottery and stoneware pottery to kids in grade school and through the rest of the year. And we had, we fired in a big gas kiln outside, and we had a little raku kiln that was fired with gas, and we did this work that year. And then I left there after that year and went down to Traverse City and started a pottery studio down there with a store. But while I was in Baraga, I started doing the pinch pots. I started experimenting with different things. And I started looking around for somebody who was doing the traditional pottery that I could study with. And I couldn't find anybody. I couldn't find anybody in the Western Great Lakes area who was doing traditional pottery in an unbroken chain. There were a few people, there were a few Indians that were doing pottery, but they were making the pots, putting Indian designs on them, then firing them in kilns. And they were doing things of this sort. And I wanted to find somebody who was actually digging the clay from the ground, making pots in the traditional way, with traditional tools. And I spent, a decade trying to find this. And I would talk to elders and I'd ask them, one in particular, I asked, well, did we ever make pottery? No, we never made pottery. And I said, but the next thing out of his mouth was, but the best clay is over here. So, I knew where to get clay. And then I learned how to do the cordage that you wrap the tools with. So because they use a cord wrapped roller or a cord wrapped paddle to paddle the pots to create those cord marked pots that you see. Mm-hmm. And in the process, I discovered that wasn't merely decorative, but that cord marking actually it's an important part of making the pot to keep it from having surface cracks all over it. It's a really important way of doing things. And so I learned a lot, and I went to museums and other places and studied the old potsherds and learned how the designs were made, learned how to make tools that match those designs, and meanwhile trying to find someone to study with. But in the process of doing this, people started coming to me, and I discovered that I had inadvertently revived the making of woodland Indian pottery in the Great Lakes, in the Western Great Lakes. And that the pots I was making were now, at one point I was told, were indistinguishable from the old work, especially if I cooked something in them and they had actually the burnt food and everything on them, like the old ones, some of the old ones do, that I had someone put one in a dig once to see if his students could tell the old pots from mine.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Wow.
And the point is, I did a lot of things like that. You've got one of them on there right now. Yep. And this pot, it's got a design that's scratched in the side, the cross hatching. It's got what's called punk decorations that are around the rim. And it's been fired upside down in a fire, so the inside has no oxygen around it. So it's in a reduction atmosphere. And when you take a red clay that's got a lot of iron oxide in it and you fire it in a reduction atmosphere, it's an atmosphere that all the oxygen has burned out of, but it's still really hot. And it wants really bad to get oxygen. So it'll reach right in the clay and grab oxygen out.
Wow.
Little space. And so the black is not carbon. That black is fired in a reduction atmosphere, and it's fired right in a fire pit. And then something laid against it during the firing, it created a reduction spot or a fire cloud on the side of it. But that's the kind of stuff that I was doing. And these are the pots that I made. I have pots in museums now all over the world. In Ulan-Ude Museum of Fine Art in southern Siberia. I have a pot in the Ethnographic Institute in St. Petersburg, Russia, where I traveled to Russia with the work years ago. I have pieces in museums, and I think I figured out once in museums and private collections, about 30 countries. All of this was before I got into politics, okay? And I had a whole life going with all of these things, and I've demonstrated, and I these days I talk about making the pots more than I actually do. I've taught, for 32 summers, I taught at an Indian youth camp teaching kids, and I taught anywhere from 20 to 40 kids a year how to do the pots. So there's hundreds and hundreds of kids now, of Indian kids that have made these and know enough about it that they actually could do it if they wanted. So, and when I say about reviving the making, it's not just that I'm making them, but that I've revived the interest to where a lot of other people are making them. And so I think that's an important part of our culture, because it's part of the material culture of pre-contact that I think is really important. And so it's because when you're doing the pottery, and I went to Northern Michigan University several years ago, there were a number of us there, Indian artists who were there, and they had a 2-week program for summer program for kids. One week was on campus, and then a whole other week was out at a camp out in the woods. And that first week they had that's when I was there. We made pots and we fired them, but they had I was teaching geology and chemistry through pottery, because I was talking about how the clay is formed, where you find it, how you use it, the chemistry of firing the clay, how you do that, the chemistry of the fire. All of those things were part of this, showing that our ancestors were scientists in their own right, and the way they did things, and the way they worked with stuff, and that they had this incredible knowledge. There was another person there doing basket making, teaching probability and statistics using basketry to do that.
Yeah.
And
wow.
So all these different people were doing this and trying to explain the full spectrum of our traditional culture and how it relates to the modern world. And I since have read a book called Native Science by Gregory Kahati. That is an absolutely amazing book that talks a lot about this. And one of the things he says is that virtually every modern science has its roots in indigenous science, in the way that things are done. And I think that's, instead of being backward, we were actually the vanguard of how things worked, and still have a wealth of knowledge about how things work. I think about reading Braiding Sweetgrass, for instance, and the whole question of ethnobotany, and how all of that stuff relates with the traditional culture and with the scientific method and all these other things, how you have to weave them back and forth together, and you can be strong, and it makes them stronger when you understand both, but it doesn't make anyone any better than the other.
And that you miss something when you're not looking at the traditional or indigenous economic, environmental knowledge and science behind some of these things. You're not hearing the full story about a plant or about an element. You just are hearing this very cryptic. It's hard to explain, but Braiding Sweetgrass is a great book to read to see how it merges together, and that you really build a relationship with the plant or the pottery and the elements of a pot, I would imagine, when you're viewing it from an indigenous perspective versus just a scientific perspective. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, well, I mean, as an example, anthropologists were telling me about the decoration done on the pots, and I had to explain to them that cord marking in the process that I use in making the pots, the cord marking is actually it creates structural strength in the pot by helping to erase all the surface cracks as you're working on it, because it works the surface back and forth as you roll a roller over it that has a spiral of cord on it. It spirals the clay back and forth over the surface and helps you make a better pot. And so the cord marking, what I figured out that's going on with this is that you'd find cord marked pots where they'd actually smoothed over most of the cord marking when they got done. And why would you cord mark the pot and smooth it over unless you needed the cord marking in order to get the shape made and to get it to base, and then you just touch the surface up to smooth it later if you wanted that. And so to me, I was able through firsthand experience and to gain a knowledge about why the tools worked and why they were made the way they were and what they did. So,
Wow. So, well, this kind of takes me into, I really want to talk to you about climate change, because you are a climate change advocate, and it's something that's really important. We haven't had an opportunity to talk about on our show before. And so if you don't mind, I'd love to shift us in that direction and I'm not even sure what to ask you about climate change, because it affects Indigenous peoples all over the world in different ways, dependent on their where they're located, right? So what's going on in Michigan? What does your work entail in climate change?
Well, you know, I tell the kids who come and talk with in the lodge here that don't be afraid of climate change. Our ancestors have lived through many of them. And you need to understand it, and you understand the perils that exist because of it. And you have to know how to adapt and live with it. But it's, to not have a fear in your heart about it, and that you need to do what you can to take care of yourself. And this is why I tell them this, because some of the people talking about climate change get into all gloom and doom all the time about stuff. But there's a lot of things that we have to deal with. I got started really dealing with climate change when I was during my 14 years as tribal chairman. I did a lot of work on Great Lakes issues and protecting the Great Lakes. I was part of developing the indigenous portion of the work to develop the Great Lakes Compact with the 8 states and the international agreement with the 8 states and the 2 Canadian provinces. That when that compact was developed, that was dealing with bulk groundwater withdrawal and diversion of water from the Great Lakes. Those were the 2 issues that were in that dealt with. And that became federal law after it got adopted. And then we worked together to try to help protect the lakes. But there were 7 other issues that existed that had been identified by leadership in the Great Lakes that needed to be worked on. And those were dealt with through a presidential order that President Bush signed, that he was running for re-election. Of course, he needed the Great Lakes states. And so he created a Great Lakes task force at the cabinet level through an executive order. And then he also, as part of that, it authorized or called for the creation of a significant regional collaboration. And then in a series of meetings, I ended up being sort of selected, or my attention wandered briefly while we were all standing in line and everybody else stepped a step back and I was still there. I ended up being the tribal leader that was the presider for the tribes from Minnesota all the way to New York on the presiders for this regional collaboration. And of that, there were also Mayor Daley of Chicago representing all the mayors, Governor Taft of Ohio, and Doyle of Wisconsin were the co-chairs of the Great Lakes Governors Association, and they were in there on this. And we had Vern Ehlers, who was a congressman from Grand Rapids, represented the Congressional Caucus. The guy, I think it was Mike Conahan, I think his last name was from the White House Domestic Policy Council, was on this. And we had the former governor from Wyoming, I believe it is, who was the EPA administrator at the time, and he was the head of it. And we were the presiders. And then that group we got a working committee of people just below us that were really doing a lot of the grunt work on this. And then below that, we have 1,500 volunteers from across the Great Lakes working on a plan for restoration and preservation of the Great Lakes, which it's a fairly long story, but in the end, we ended up with a 75-page document with a 500-page addendum with all the technical data in it. But it called for $15 billion of investment in the Great Lakes to deal with issues. And I testified on behalf of the funding, because I was still one of the leaders in this. I testified for funding before Senator Obama and Senator Clinton and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee for funding on a bill that Senator Levin from Michigan had introduced, and a companion bill that Congressman Emanuel from Illinois had introduced. and Congressman Ehlers had introduced. And so these funding bills together were passed eventually. We didn't get $15 billion. We got $475 million, and it went to EPA and it became the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the GLRI. And we have now gotten just over $2 billion in the intervening years of money to help fix infrastructure and do other things in the Great Lakes. But it's been a political football that's been difficult to keep funded through the rescission time. The money went quite low. A couple times the president had zeroed it out in the budget, but the Great Lakes Caucus put it back in. And we were able to do a lot of work to work on things such as bioaccumulative toxics like mercury, to do work on invasive species, on point source pollution and nearshore habitats, and all of these shipping issues. All of these issues, there's 7 of them, were part of this big plan. And in the process of doing that, we also were working on negotiating the Treaty of 1836. We had fishing rights in the U.S. versus Michigan fishing rights case. Those rights were recognized by the court. And when this was the Great Lakes portion of that suit, and in doing that, there was a negotiation about how we were going to do the fishing, and that had to be renegotiated several times because we had a consent decree. And then the inland portion of this comes up, and during the inland portion, I was the chair during the inland portion of the negotiations, and we were very careful to realize very early on at this time that we couldn't be species specific in our negotiations about fishing and hunting rights. And the reason we couldn't is because of climate change. That things were changing and that different species would be moving in and some would be moving out. And that this consent decree we were working on was a permanent consent decree. It's going to last forever. So if we agreed that we could fish for whitefish and nothing else, the whitefish might leave us and we would be without any fish. So we had to not be species specific in so many different things. The same thing like with, the maple tree. Maple is, Ninatig. It's our tree. And it's really important to us. It's so important, that's the way we named it. And some of the studies I've seen show that by 2050, the area that I live in will no longer be the natural habitat for the sugar maple because it's moving north and with the changing climate. So what does it mean to our people when our tree is now living elsewhere? Okay. In other words, we have to think about these kind of things when we're dealing with climate change. So we have to be aware of the different species. I read an article just last week about how species in the open ocean are moving away from the equator. So the fish that lived at the equator are now moving 500 to 1,000 miles north and south of the equator. And there's nothing moving back in where they were because there's nothing yet adapted to that warmer water to an extent. So any indigenous people that fish along the equator, their fish are leaving them and nothing's coming in. Now, the people that are 2,500 miles north of there or so, or 1,000 miles north, some of their species may be leaving and moving north, but there's other fish coming in from the south. So there's this movement. But what does that mean for us in the Great Lakes, where it's pretty much they're going to live in the lake or not live in the lake, because the lake is hundreds of miles long. And in our case, Lake Michigan is it's only about 1 degree away from no longer being a habitat for one of our major fish called the whitefish. And so, we have to be aware of these things and think about them. So when we talk about climate change here, what does it mean to us? It means that we have to be thinking about our adaptability, thinking about our our ability to deal with these changes. In previous climate changes, our people could move with them. So if it got too warm here, we just move further north. Well, now we're fixed geopolitically with international borders that we didn't put down, with reservation boundaries that are where our jurisdiction is tied physically to the land in these areas, and so we have to learn how to adapt to what these changes are coming over us rather than moving with the changes. And so I say all this as a basis for why we do what we do. So I went to Paris as one of the indigenous people. There were like 200 or 300 of us that were credentialed inside amongst the 25,000 people that were at the Paris Climate Accords. Okay. And then we had several hundreds more people that were outside that were not credentialed to be inside, that were doing things on demonstrations and other things on the outside. So the indigenous people were very well represented at Paris. And we had some goals when we went to Paris, and one of them was to try to lobby for 1.5 degrees Celsius above, to put a cap at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels of temperature. And the U.S. and China had sort of reached an agreement that 2 degrees would be what they would do when they went into the negotiations. But nobody knew exactly what was going to happen at these changes. Well, we're about 1.3 or 1.4 degrees right now. Wow. Where we're at right now, we haven't hit 1.5 yet. But look at all the things that have happened. And we realize 1.5 is really disastrous to the world. 2 degrees, we're going to lose southern Louisiana, a significant part of Bangladesh. At 2 degrees, there's 30 or 40 million climate refugees around the world that are going to be out there. We have, and the climate refugees are not just people, because we have to think not just about, when we're talking about environmental justice, environmental issues, it isn't just human populations. We have to think about those populations of all those other beings that we share the world with. Mm-hmm. And what responsibilities do we have to them? Because they have responsibilities to us, we have responsibilities to them. They feed us, they take care of us, they help provide food and shelter and stuff for us. We take care of them. There's this relationship we have. It's not, we don't just own these things, but we have a relationship with them. And so it's maintaining those relationship rights is critical. And I maintain that's really what our treaty rights are all about. It's not property rights so much as it's relationship rights. And so we have all these things to prepare. So when we went to Paris, we successfully got well under 2 degrees with 1.5 in mind, is the way it worded. It wasn't just us. It was all the island and coastal nations that were fighting for this, and a whole lot of countries were fighting for this. And eventually that was the goal that was set in Paris. And we also got an acknowledgement of traditional knowledge, of indigenous traditional knowledge in the accord, as was a critical thing for us, because we wanted, and probably the most important part in there was the fact that we wanted indigenous rights included. We wanted human rights, including the rights of indigenous people, to be acknowledged in this. And those were things that we successfully got. So while we should have and could have fought and tried a lot more, and there were people that came home from Paris just devastated that we didn't get more. And so you'll find a lot of press about things that we didn't get. But what we did get was important. And those things were, I think, have proven to be long-lasting and positive things that we've worked with in terms of trying to make, trying to find a way to have climate change to be dealing with it. With the current administration and the rejoining the Paris Accord and the idea of working on what are called NDCs, nationally determined contributions. Those are what all of the signers of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the body that's doing all this work, It's a subsidiary of the UN, that UNFCCC. Within that, there's a facilitative working group that is Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments together, working together, which was a very important part of the implementation of the Paris Accord. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that any mitigation efforts that are done internationally are not done on the backs of Indigenous people. In other words, that we aren't the sacrifice zone for the rest of the world, so that they can keep doing what they're doing, and they'll just give up all of our land and give up all of our rights and all of our animals and all of our lives, actually, for the ability to keep moving the way they're doing. And so when I talk about, I've talked about this on several occasions, where when you try to do market-based solutions to climate change, which are basically, I'm going to grow a tree here so you can fly somewhere. So you're going to burn fossil fuels to fly somewhere, and I'm going to grow a tree. Well, the tree's going to grow, and that's important, and I think it's good, but allowing me to sell you the credit for growing the tree so that you can fly somewhere, it doesn't mean that the world's any better off in terms of how much fossil fuel is burned. And that fossil fuel is 65 million year old fuel. That's carbon that's been out of the carbon cycle for 65 million years. And for the last 200 years or so, we've been burning that at huge rates, at an increasing rate, even today. And that carbon, we're putting more carbon in the air than has ever been there during all of human history. We don't know where this is going to go, what's going to happen with it. We don't know the answer to that. And so I'm going to let that phone go away here in a minute.
Maybe someone has a question they want to ask you for the show.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, just a second. I think it's going to.
That's okay.
Well, so there we are. Okay. This, but that idea to me, that we have to find ways to lessen the emission of greenhouse gases. And the ways that do that, if you're doing that through carbon trading and other kinds of things, that's not as effective. To me, it's like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while it sinks. That to me, that's something we have to be careful of. So our traditional values talk about how we relate to the world around us and how we take care of our relatives and they take care of us. And when we ignore our connection to the natural world and try to exist in spite of the natural world, or, well, the natural world, they can take care of itself. I'm going to go down to the grocery store and buy my groceries, and I'm going to go to the gas station, buy my gas, and then I'm going to drive home and I'm going to cook this on my gas range, and I'm going to sit down in my carpeted home and watch TV for a while, and that's my day. If you got to realize how all of those things are related to and depend upon the natural world, and that there is a limit to how much we can extract out of the natural world before we tip the balance in the wrong direction. So if we're going to truly respect our relatives, if we're going to truly respect our ancestors and our descendants, we have to find ways to walk more softly on Mother Earth.
Yes. You said a really wise thing, and then maybe we'll wrap up, and so you can get your phone calls.
Well,
but
it's
you said a wise thing to me when we were talking about, but you tend to do that, Frank. A lot of people think so highly of you, not just for your federal Indian policy smarts, your smarts as a tribal leader, and your practical knowledge and your creative knowledge, but also your spiritual understanding and the way you really help I know for the association, you've really been a wonderful guide for us in so many different ways. And one of the things that you said to me when we were planning the show is I asked you, well, what's a little phrase, what you have such a varied background. How can I sum you up in a quick phrase? And you're like, I'm a human being. I'm a human being working on Indigenous issues, right? It was just like we forget that we are something very simple that has a role in this planet. And I think that's a little bit of what you're talking about. But do you want to kind of expand on that thought?
Well, I guess one way to think about it is I mentioned the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, that the nations are figuring out how to cut, emissions through regulation and through other types of ways of doing things, and through investment in new energy sources and things of this sort as a nation. Well, we also have indigenous nations that are doing things, and my nation is, 5,000 people or so. We have a modest casino operation in terms of as they go around the country. And in that operation alone, we've saved, because of the way we've been using energy, we've saved around 500,000 metric tons of carbon in 10 years that haven't been burned to do the energy that we need because of the way we've handled ourselves. So we're developing what I call an IDC, an indigenously determined contribution. What can your tribal nation do to be part of this? To not just tell the rest of the world that they have to straighten up because they're wrong, but to show how we're fixing ourselves as well, and we're putting our actions where our mouths are in terms of that issue. But then in addition to that, there's also a PDC, a personally determined contribution. What does that mean? That means every single individual can figure out what they personally are going to do. That means, if you're driving all over the place to do things, consolidating your trips so you make one trip instead of 5 to do something, it's just always leaving just to do one thing. You can wait and do them all at once. It means taking the stairs instead of the elevator. One place has told me that they cut their energy consumption on the elevator by just having this policy that you should use the stairs instead of the elevator whenever you can. They saved over 25% of their energy cost on the elevator operating. And that's a big thing at the end of several years. And but personally, we can personally do these things. If we're when in terms of water, I always tell people turn a faucet off while you're brushing your teeth. I've been telling people that for almost 20 years now.
Yeah.
It's really simple, but if you live in a municipal, you're using municipal water, it means water is not being pumped out of the ground, purified, piped to your house, and then goes back and recycled back out the treatment plant. It means that there's all that energy not being spent just to run the water while you're brushing your teeth. And if everybody did that, what does that mean? So there's lots of steps like that you can take individually. So an individual person, it's not something that is so huge that there's nothing anybody can do about it. Everybody can do something. Everybody can do something that uses less energy or uses energy in a better way, and also that helps protect the natural world, which is helping to protect us because it protects our relationships. And you live a lot richer life when you're aware of all of the beings around you, all of the things that you need to help keep you balanced and healthy, and that they need us as well.
Right. Yes. There's an interesting comment in our chat. Robert, I'm sharing your comment. This guy speaks for 90 minutes and you realize it's just the tip of the iceberg. Keep him talking, he says. And it is, believe me. And I'm going to be spending 2 days with Frank next week during our board meetings. And it's as painful as any board meeting can be. I'm so grateful that Frank is there to lead all of us and really make it as pleasant an experience as possible for the work we do at the association. And you're right, Robert. I'm always grateful for my time with Frank. So what's this about you being a human being, Frank? What does that mean? What does that mean to you?
It means I breathe, and that I am. It means that I am aware of my imperfections, and that I tell people that my goal in life is to strengthen goodness and discourage evil. It isn't to be all good, and it isn't to defeat evil, because it's a continuum. It's something that you have to do so you can make things a little better. I was always taught to leave every place you go a little cleaner than you found it. If it's picking up a gum wrapper, or if it's just sitting in a meeting trying to absorb a little bit of the negative energy that comes out of the meeting to take it out of the conversation. That's something that people can do. If it means driving down the road and slowing down so you can let somebody in ahead of you because there's a line of cars behind you, and if you don't do that, they're going to be there for another 20 minutes. Well, you can do things like that, and you just do those little things that help make the world a better place. And to me, that's what it is, because every day, the same elder that spoke for so many minutes that day that I talked about very at the beginning, also, we always used to say, he'd talk at ceremonies and other places, and he'd always say, Anjishin and Marading, the good, the bad. He'd always say, every day you have to choose. And you always have to choose. And sometimes more than once a day you have to choose. And you make these little choices. Life is a culmination of all of these choices. And if you've made bad choices in the past, it doesn't mean you're locked into them. It means you can just start making good ones. And so every day you have to choose. And he'd say the same thing. And every time he talked, he'd say the same thing. And finally, one day somebody asked him, they said, why do you always say the same thing? And he leaned up and he said, because I don't think they've got it yet.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of what we do is, being a human being, we're aware of who we are, and we try to do the best we can and leave every place we go a little bit better than we found it.
Mm-hmm. And, that makes me think of, because people don't treat each other very well anymore. And it has seemed to have gotten worse. And I think we've forgotten about our own human beingness. And so, and when we do that, we treat others so if others do something wrong, we treat them like they are bad. And we don't often give other people the benefit of the doubt. And I think we do that to other people because we're forgetting that we're human beings ourselves, make mistakes. Mm-hmm. And that we, so there's this kind of, you're pointing a finger out and three are pointing back at you. It's so important that we remember that we are fallible and that we're responsible to make sure that we do try to make the next breath a little better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. No big deal. This has been wonderful, Frank, and I could sit here for forever, but I know it's dinner time in your neck of the woods, and want you to get some food and have a nice weekend. And having anything interesting happening this weekend with Rochelle, or
I get to plant my peas and my corn and my spinach this weekend. And the garden's ready. It's tilled and everything's ready to go. And I put my asparagus in 2 weeks ago, and so we've got. I you think about working for the future. Well, you put an asparagus bed in, it'll produce for 20 to 30 years when you do it right. So you spend a lot of time putting it in and getting it right, because the theory is you're not going to have to do it again. And in my case, I probably won't have to do it again in my life. I'll be eating asparagus out of that as long as I live. So, so it's those are the kind of things I've been working on right now is looking to the future, and putting wanting to be sure to have good healthy food and have a good time while I'm doing it.
Yes, for sure. I want to thank you so much, Frank. Yokoki, thank you for taking time out this evening to hang out with us and chat. I think you're a hit. Everyone loves you. Let's see what John says. John says, existentialism defined, to be a human being. So I'm for the time and for all of you out there in the chat listening to us tonight. I want to make sure everyone's aware to go to our YouTube channel and push on like and subscribe and give us a comment or two. And wanted to give you a couple of heads up on stuff. Frank, I don't know if you know this even. We have some funding for our summer camp grant program this summer. So if you're a part of a Native youth summer camp program or project that's run by a tribe or a Native organization, we have a grant program that we do every summer. And so our application is on our website at indian-affairs.org. You can apply. I think it's open until May 31st. And then we're going to award some money to those summer camps to help with costs. We also have our Repatriation conference coming up. And on November 3rd, 10th, and 17th. And we just announced our session proposals. So please, if you want to present at our Repatriation conference, our session proposals, I believe, are due June the 7th, and that's also on our website. And our scholarships, we give scholarships every semester, and our scholarship deadline for our applications closes on May 31st as well. So everyone, please head to our website and see what we're doing, and make sure you meet those deadlines. And Frank, you're going to hear about them all again next week at our board meeting. And
well, I have something that I want to say too, and that is that as president of the board, I have a lot of different roles, and as you saw with my resume, there's a lot of different things going on. But it's been my honor to be, and is currently my honor to be, president of this board of this organization that's nearly 100 years old. And I really want to commend you in your role in what you're doing with Red Hoop Talk and with all the other things you're doing, because you're helping to be part of this long-standing tradition that all of us are part of working on. And we're able to keep this organization going and to be able to provide a positive influence in Indian country. And while we're not a big organization, we are able to do a lot with what we have. And I want to thank you for your efforts in doing that. So I wanted to acknowledge that before we got done today.
Thank you, Frank. And I'm going to shut it off there before I put my foot in my mouth and have to take all, and you have to take all that back. So I want to thank all of you for watching tonight. And we'll see you next week, next Friday on Red Hoop Talk, where our guest will be Gina Timberman, who is from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So I'll finally have a sister here with me next week. See you all next week.